Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Captain DevOps YouTube channel. And today we'll be taking a look at the Develop an AI app within the Azure AI Foundry SDK. This is a module from the AI 102 certification and its own self-paced learning path on Microsoft Learn. So today we'll be taking a look into this, and let's begin. So developers creating AI solutions with Azure AI Foundry need to work with a combination of services and software frameworks, and the SDK is designed to bring together common services and code libraries in an AI project through a central programmatic access point, making it easier for developers to write the code needed to build effective AI apps on Azure. And here we will learn how to use the SDK itself to work with resources in an AI project. And as it says here, it's currently in preview, but let's move on. First off, I'll choose my development language as Python, since it's a bit easier to set up, and I'm more familiar with it. But anyway, the Foundry is a set of the SDK is a set of packages and services designed to work together and enable developers to write code that uses resources in an AI Foundry project. With it, developers can create applications that connect to a project, access the resource connections and models in the project, and use them to perform AI operations, such as sending prompts to a generative AI model and processing the responses. And here it says that it provides both Python and C#.NET libraries. What else? Some capabilities may not be available for both languages, so that's okay. And here's how we install it. It's pretty much the Azure AI projects package on PyPy. Maybe we can take a look into it. And let's see what it's about. So PyPy, if you are not aware, is sort of a public repository for all public Python modules. I think it's maintained by the core maintainers of the Python language itself. And usually when you are going to find a library and you don't really have to authenticate anywhere, it's going to be hosted in here. So here it even says pip install Azure AI project. So yeah, here it is. And there are a bunch of things that we can do. Here you can see a very, very important detail of how these Azure SDKs usually work behind the hood, or rather under the hood, which is that the client library uses version 25.515 preview of the AI Foundry data plane REST APIs. So usually when Microsoft provides an SDK for a service in Azure, you are probably going to find a wrapper over the Azure APIs themselves, which is very cool because then Microsoft only has to usually the features in the API are going to be very easily ported over to the SDK since they are using very similar architectures and parameters in order to work. So this is a very much more concise getting started guide, which is you need to have a Python installed, an Azure subscription, a project in AI Foundry. You need to get the endpoint, the Entra ID token for authentication, and this token you can get in a couple of ways apparently. Let's see. No, this is like the recommended way, which is using AZ login and using an account that has the appropriate role assignment. And here there are some key concepts of this library. Maybe let's increase the text a bit just to, yeah. So here is how we authenticate. So we create a client object with the credentials and the endpoint. What else? We can also construct an asynchronous client. So this is a little example of how we perform the agent operation. So maybe let's see here what's going on. The agent is created using this create agent method, which gets a model, a name and instructions, and then it returns an ID. And here we have a link to some samples in Microsoft repository. Maybe let's take a look into that as well, just as a little sidetracking thing. But after we do whatever we need to do with the agent, then we can delete the agent. So that's pretty cool. And later we'll probably learn how to do this using the portal as well. But I believe that using the Python SDK to create it is probably cleaner in a production setting. Get an authenticated Azure OpenAI client rather. So you can see here that, as I said, I think in the previous video, there is a lot of overlap between the AI Foundry SDKs and APIs and the Azure OpenAI services. What I think happened in the past, if I recall correctly, is that first there was the Azure OpenAPI resources, and this was about 2022, 2023, I guess, when Microsoft announced its partnership with OpenAI. And after a while, more and more AI models started showing up, and then Azure sort of created a whole other AI solution to use the other models that weren't from OpenAI, but they still kept around the old APIs, which is the case here. But as we saw yesterday, the recommended approach, even with OpenAI models today, is to use the Azure AI project client here and the Azure AI projects SDK rather. And I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about here. You can see there are a lot of things here, so let's maybe just gloss over them real fast. So this is the OpenAI client, the deployments operations. So you can list the deployments. What else? You can filter by the model publisher, list all deployments of a specific model, and get a single deployment by the name. You can also interact with the project connections. So listing, filtering them, getting the default connection with or without credentials, and also filtering connections by their name. The dataset operations. So maybe we'll also learn a bit more about what this means, because I'm not really sure. Upload files in a folder, upload a single file, create a new dataset. Yeah, this looks like a construct from the AI project that I'm not aware. So apparently there is, using this sort of operations, we can start uploading data directly to the AI Foundry project and use that as sort of a grounding for our agents, which is pretty cool. Index operations. So here we can update or create indexes, and in this case the indexes, I believe, refer to specific I may be wrong about this, but I think that the indexes here are probably referring to that long string of the long array of numbers that we talked about various times now, which convey a specific meaning. Yeah, maybe that's what it's referring to, but I'm sure that it will become clear maybe in the future. The evaluation, which is very, very important. So this is something that I already talked about a bit. And here, thank you, Alexa. And here is the full example of how to create an evaluation. An evaluation is very interesting for me because when we write software, actually, let's go back a bit further. When we create AI projects, we are essentially creating software projects, as I already mentioned a while back. And still the same best practices apply, and the same tried and true methods that we use to test and deploy and validate that the software projects are working also work very well with AI projects. at least as a starting point, because AI has a couple of more factors around it that make some patterns in software a bit different. And one of them is the testing phase. So when we talk about software, usually we want to create a very robust testing strategy for the software, because we want to be confident that the business logic that we want the software to have is actually translated into code. And if we change the code and break the business logic, we want to have a safety net to show that we broke it. And in the case of software, this is equivalent to the unit test, integration tests, and end-to-end tests, as well as a lot of other tests that QA engineers will happily talk to you about if you ask them. But the basic building block is the unit test. And the unit test pretty much says that a specific function is guaranteed to give a specific output if you provided a specific input. And the equivalent for unit tests is, for AI projects, is an evaluation. So if you think about the nature of unit tests doesn't really translate to the AI model, because if you provide the same prompt to an AI model twice, it will spit out two different answers. And this we call non-deterministic behavior. Whereas code, you can think about maybe you have a function that sums two numbers, and if you provide them 2 and 2, it's always going to return 4. So this is deterministic behavior, because we can always guarantee that unless we change the function in any way, the result of it with the same two inputs is always going to be the same output. And so evaluations are sort of, so you can see here like the skeleton for an evaluation. And this is an object on the SDK, and it has a name, a description, a data set for a sample data set, which is, I believe, is also important here, and the configurations of the evaluators. So there is a relevance evaluator. What else? The violence evaluator and the blue score, which I'm not sure what it is, but yeah. And all of those evaluators, they are looking at different aspects of example questions and answers to the AI. I'm not really too sure about how this specifically is working, but for example, the relevance parameter, it maybe you can get a hint here, because data mapping, we can see that it gets from this data set here, and yeah, upload a single file and create a new data set to reference the file. So when we upload this file, this file probably has a bunch of key value mappings of queries and expected responses. So based on that, we can evaluate the responses and queries to see how relevant they were, based on what this specific evaluator considers relevant. Also, this violence evaluator, and yeah, this blue score, I believe I have heard about it. It's sort of a sum of other scores that are very common. But yeah, it's very, very good. And I think this about covers the AI projects SDK. So maybe let's carry on here. So using the SDK to connect to a project, we already talked a bit about that, which is getting the endpoint from this page. And here you can see we have 3 different endpoints, which I mentioned: Azure AI Foundry, Azure OpenAPI, and Azure AI Services. I believe the Azure AI Services is a bit more generic, so you have to do a bit more work to do the same things as you would do in the Azure AI Foundry SDK, for example, or rather with the endpoint. Let's see. Sorry, I probably got that wrong. The AI Services APIs, they are probably not everything that's AI, but it's not a large language model. So here is AI vision and an AI language, for example. So maybe let's consider that like as a very simple explanation of why there are 3 endpoints here. And also the API key is very important, but I'm not sure if we are using it here. Yeah. So here, when we use the default Azure credential, we assume that the environment that we're at has the AZ login token, which is talked about here. Yeah, but if we run this, for example, on a function or a container app or a virtual machine that has a managed identity in Azure, then it's going to pull the managed identity from that place. So we don't really have to worry about managing credentials for an application or a service principal, because this is already done for us, which is very handy and very secure. Let's see here, work with project connections. If each project includes connected resources, and they can be defined at the parent or project level, and each resource is a connection to an external service, such as all of these. So here we can manage the connected resources, and in this case we have a Foundry project, which is connected to an AI services project. Yep. And the AI project client has a connections property, which I can use to access the resource connections in the project. So we can list the connections and get the connections using the connection name, and we can also choose or to include the credentials or not, which is something we saw earlier as well. So if you can see here, this is a bit of an example of getting the project client and listing all of the connections, but it's not really doing anything with them. But if we were, for example, to use this, like let's think about where we could use this. Let's say, for example, that you have an AI project that uses a large language model, but you also need some access to Azure AI Vision, for example. And from the project itself, you can get the connection for the AI Vision project and tell it to include the credentials as well. So then you can, just from this call to the AI project SDK, you can already have all of the necessary things that you need to call the AI services project and get your data from there, which is handy. So let's see how we can create a chat client. Yeah, it's to connect to a generative AI model and use prompts to engage in a chat-based dialogue with it. We can connect directly. Get Azure OpenAI client method in the inference operations. So maybe let's take a look at the code, because for me it's a bit easier to sort of learn what's going on in the fly here. So here we are connecting to the AI project, since like we did earlier, and here we are getting a chat client, which is here. Using the project client, we get an Azure OpenAI client using this API version. We input, and this like shows up in the terminal, and whatever the user writes in the terminal and presses enter, then it gets saved to this user prompt value. This is what the input function does in Python. And based on this string here, we can ask the chat client to complete using a particular model. And here is the actual system prompt, which is very interesting to see in a sort of JSON format. Not really a JSON format, but as a Python dictionary. Because we can see here that we pass the system prompt here. You are a helpful AI assistant. Maybe there's a way to sort of always pass this, but probably that's something that we can learn using the API itself, the SDK rather, and the content, which is the actual prompt that the user made here. And as a response, as a return, we get the response, and apparently the response has a bunch of choices, and we can filter the first choice, get its message, and get the context, which is probably the raw string with the response. This is very cool. So now we have a little bit of an exercise, and this probably opens up the Microsoft Learning.github.io. And what we are going to do in this exercise is creating the AI project, creating the AI application to chat with the model. What else? And it's already providing a bit of a sample repository here for us to use. Yeah, we can activate the Python environment, get the environment variables, replace the placeholder variables here, open things in Visual Studio Code, add some references, create a client, authenticate to the project, create the OpenAI client here, and initialize the prompt. And okay, so here we can see how we don't really need to pass the system prompt every time, which is using the prompt.append method. Very handy. Which, to be honest, is just like a native Python method to interact with lists. And we get the completion and role assistant. The content is the completion. So this is a bit of a way to create a memory for the agent. And now we can sign into Azure and run the app. So I'm not sure if I'm going to do this one because we already covered it, and it's a bit of a basic application here. So I'm not sure how valuable it would be compared to the amount of time that it would take me to set all of this up. But I will leave this as an exercise to the viewer, and we can move along because there are a lot of other things that we also need to learn here. But don't worry about not putting things in practice too much for now, because as the month goes on, I intend to have some separate moments in which we can spend a lot of time very deeply working with the code and understanding the SDKs, and maybe creating some simple projects for us to really learn more deeply than what the Learn modules can teach us here by putting everything into practice. So let's take a look at the questions. What class in the AI Foundry SDK provides a proxy object for a project? And here these are C# methods, but the Python methods usually have the same names. And in this case, it's the AI project client. I believe the chat completions client is something that we can get from the AI project client. And the connection properties, I'm not sure what it's about. What value is needed to instantiate AI project client object? And that would be the project endpoint. Because, yeah, the subscription ID doesn't really have anything to do with it. And the OpenAI authorization key is might be necessary for some operations, but even if we have a password, we also need to provide an endpoint anyway. So I believe the project endpoint is the most correct answer here. And which SDK should you use to chat with the model? And that we saw that this is the Azure OpenAI SDK. Let's submit the answers and see. And there we go. And that wraps up this module here. And today we learn a bit about how the Python, specifically SDK, works for Azure AI projects, and also took a look at some common patterns of how to program chat clients using it, also agents, and some other details about the deployment and authentication, and what's important for us to know if you are going to start a project using the AI Foundry SDK, which is very handy. And we are definitely going to use this SDK in some future projects that we are going to do in this series. So keep an eye out for that. But the next module we have here is to get started with the prompt flow to develop language model apps in the Azure AI Foundry, which is going to be the next video. So I'll be waiting for you there. And if you have any suggestions, or if you like the video or anything else, remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and also comment down below if you want to dive deeper into any specific topic. And I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.